The smell of stale fryer grease and the humid rot of the city air were the only constants in Caleb's life. He stood at the scratched formica counter of their cramped kitchen, the cheap linoleum floor cold against his calloused feet. His clothes still carried the faint, metallic scent of the construction site from which he had been laid off that morning. His shoulders sagged like an old man's, bearing a weight heavier than any steel beam he'd ever lifted, the crushing, impossible weight of failure. He was 32 years old, possessed a master's degree in architectural design, and had $47,000 of student debt that felt like a permanent, invisible shackle. Across the room, Elara sat at their small, bolted-down table, a stack of overdue bills resting beside her sketch pad. She didn't have to look up to know the news. Her hollow-eyed look was all the confirmation he needed. They had reached the bitter, bottom-most floor of their life. The final eviction notice from the bank had arrived 2 days earlier, a thin white rectangle of indifference that promised to strip them of the only true permanence they had left, their home. The tension in the air between them was a thick, suffocating blanket. They were partners in a doomed venture, watching the walls close in. Caleb's stomach was a rumbling reminder of his skipped lunch, a hunger that went far deeper than food, a hunger for purpose, for a single, small win. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was on that absolute zero of their existence that the certified letter arrived. A large, stiff envelope bearing the seal of an expensive law firm 2 states over, a firm whose services were beyond the wildest dreams of a man like Caleb. Elara watched him from the table as he used a box cutter to slice through the thick paper. He hadn't bothered to sit down. Inside was a heavy legal document, folded precisely, accompanied by 2 other objects, a small, faded photograph and an antique brass key. The letter was the last will and testament of Caleb's great-uncle, Silas Thorn, a man Caleb hadn't seen since a brief, confusing visit when he was 8. Silas had always been an eccentric, a recluse who wrote rambling letters from the far reaches of the Mojave Desert, letters Caleb's own father had dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. Silas had passed away quietly 2 weeks before, and the letter stated simply that Caleb, as the last living relative, was his sole heir. The inheritance was not a savings account or a house in the suburbs. It was a 20-unit motor lodge, built on a desolate stretch of highway 300 miles from the nearest proper town, called the Solstice Inn. Caleb read the name aloud, the syllables sounding alien and strange in the claustrophobic apartment air. Elara's eyes were wide, blinking against the sudden, shocking surge of possibility that cut through the darkness. The document detailed the contents of the property: the land, the main building, the units, the maintenance shed, and a sparse collection of personal effects. Then, on a separate, crisp white sheet of paper, a single paragraph was typed in a heavy block font, a postscript to a life of quiet paranoia. It was Silas's final, emphatic command. The structure's true value is secured. Its location is the defense. The contents of room 12 are a temptation. Do not enter. Do not open it. Do not attempt to bypass the defenses. To disregard this counsel is to invite ruin. The words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of a stone slab, suggesting not just an inconvenience, but a genuine, escalating danger. The paragraph ended there, a chilling, open-ended threat with no context or explanation. Caleb looked down at the physical evidence of this strange instruction. Clutched in his hand was a heavy, tarnished brass key, a true artifact, its head stamped with the raised numeral 12. The key, Silas's final temptation, was his immediate, unanswerable question. What was in room 12? A room so vital it required a lawyer-noted warning. A room so dangerous It was worth the ruin of the only man left to him. The motel was their chance, the sudden, miraculous second chance they had prayed for. But the key was the door to a dark and unknown history. The weight of the brass in Caleb's palm felt like the balance of their future, a promise of escape and an implied threat, an open loop that immediately demanded closure. They had only enough gas and credit to make the journey, an all-or-nothing roll of the dice in the darkest corner of the California desert. The choice was instantly clear: return to the inevitable foreclosure or drive toward the only hope they had left, a hope that lay 300 miles away, waiting behind a single, forbidden door. The desert swallowed the road, and then it tried to swallow them. 2 days of driving had scoured the city grime from their car and replaced it with a fine, omnipresent layer of ochre dust. The landscape had grown hostile, a vast, silent ocean of scrub brush and rock where the sun was not a benevolent light, but an insistent, punishing hammer. The air conditioning in the old sedan had failed hours ago, and the silence between Caleb and Elara had returned, less tense this time, but heavier, burdened by the unknown. Just as the gas gauge needle trembled on empty, the motel appeared. It was not a picturesque ruin. It was a monument to neglect, a concrete block corpse baked dry by decades of sun. The Solstice Inn stood alone, a crooked line of 20 identical low-slung units facing a cracked parking lot the size of a landing strip. The sign out front was a faded masterpiece of the 1950s, a massive metal sunburst that now served only as target practice. It was riddled with bullet holes. The peeling paint hung in long, brittle strips. The whole structure sagged against the mountain backdrop, looking lean and weathered like an old fence post. There was no sound but the dry whistle of the wind and the crunch of their tires on the neglected gravel. They pulled up to the single, slightly taller unit marked office. The door was sealed tight, the glass of its small window opaque with dust and the grime of years. Caleb used a utility knife to pry free the window latch, wincing at the high-pitched squeal of rusted metal. The air that rushed out was stale and heavy, smelling of old paper, dust, and something else. Something sharp and metallic, like dried blood or ozone. Inside, the space was tiny and cramped. A desk was bolted to the floor. The only items of interest were stacked neatly in a corner, protected by a heavy, tattered blanket. A handful of strange, leather-bound books filled with what looked like astrological charts and engineering symbols. A single, rolled-up, cryptic map of the property drawn in looping, precise lines, and a thick, cloth-wrapped journal. All of it was locked inside a small, fire-rated safe, bolted directly into the concrete floor behind the desk. Caleb turned the combination lock handle again and again, but the code had died with Silas. The rest of the motel offered no immediate clues. They walked the perimeter, checking the 11 units they knew were intended for guests. Each door opened with a groan to reveal a dusty, Spartan relic of the 1970s. 2 single beds, a small, chipped dresser, and a bathroom fixture stained an aggressive avocado green. Each room was identical, utterly unremarkable, a sterile testament to anonymity. Caleb tried to focus on the repairs, on the endless, tedious work needed to make the place habitable, but his mind kept returning to the mystery, to the key resting heavy in his pocket. The memory arrived unbidden, triggered by the smell of the damp concrete block. It was the last time he had seen Silas, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. The desert had felt vast even then, a terrifying space where the silence was not peaceful, but waiting. Silas had him cornered against a concrete laundry sink in the maintenance shed, his uncle's eyes wide and darting, checking the small, high window for the watchers. Silas's hands were stained with black ink, and he was perpetually hunched over a drawing, detailing complex, swirling glyphs and occult-looking diagrams. He didn't look at Caleb when he spoke, his voice reduced to a dry, cracked whisper. "They think it's abandoned," Silas had murmured, tracing a line on the dirt floor with his boot heel. "They think the door is sealed. But they don't understand the function. The function requires silence, the silence of the earth." He had gripped Caleb's shoulder then, his fingers digging in tight. "You're an architect, boy. You see straight lines. You trust the foundation. But listen to me. If you live to be 100, you will trust nothing built of concrete. Nothing." The Moat warning, bizarre then, resonated with terrifying clarity now. Nothing built of concrete. He snapped back to the present, his skin tingling with the memory. He and Elara were standing before the final unit in the long line. Room 12. Unlike the others, Room 12 had no windows at all, its single exterior wall an unbroken expanse of faded plaster. The door was a solid, thicker slab than the rest, freshly painted a dark, almost midnight blue, and centered on it was a hastily but precisely drawn white crescent moon. The door was not just locked, it was fortified. It had the standard deadbolt and knob lock, and above those, a massive rusted industrial bolt, a heavy iron fixture that looked as if it belonged on a bank vault or a ship's hatch, not a motel room. It was held fast by a thick padlock that was clearly meant to be permanent. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key, the one that had arrived in the envelope. He slid it into the standard deadbolt. It turned perfectly, the mechanism clicking open with a metallic sigh. But the brass key was useless against the massive, corroded industrial lock that sealed the door like a tomb. They were left facing a final, immovable obstruction, an escalating mystery. Room 12 was not just a storage room, it was a vault, and whatever lay behind the door was guarded by more than a promise of ruin. It was guarded by iron, steel, and a lock designed to stop anyone, including the rightful owner, from ever getting inside. The first thing Caleb and Elara did was seek counsel, not from a lawyer, but from a local. In the dusty, forgotten gas station 10 miles down the road, they found Jesse, a man whose face was lean and weathered like an old fence post. He was a handyman who knew the Solstice Inn and the land it stood on. Jesse agreed to help clean and repair the open units, accepting only cash and a nervous deference to the local legends. While sweeping out Unit 3, he offered them his warning, spoken in a low, gravelly voice. He told them the motel had been a bad place for 50 years, maybe more. People checked in, he said, but they rarely checked out, their absences swallowed by the silence and the endless dark landscape. He spoke of Silas not as a crazy old man, but as a sentinel, someone guarding a deep secret. His local knowledge only solidified the dread that had begun to settle over Caleb. They were halfway through the second day of cleaning, with the oppressive heat pushing down on the roof like a physical force, when the black sedan arrived. It appeared as if from nowhere, a sleek, utterly out-of-place machine cutting through the shimmer of the heat haze. It was a luxury vehicle, dark and imposing, its arrival announcing a financial power that did not belong in this derelict corner of the world. The man who emerged from the driver's side was even more out of place. He was crisp, tailored, and coolly professional, wearing a suit that must have cost more than the entire annual revenue of the Solstice Inn. This was Mr. Thorn, the antagonist. Thorn introduced himself without preamble, claiming to be Silas's former financial advisor, though his manner was less advisory and more institutional. He did not offer condolences. He offered a transaction. He stood in the swirling dust, dismissing the motel with a curt, disdainful look. "The property is a liability, Mr. Thorn," he stated, his voice a smooth, toneless instrument of finance. The transfer of ownership to you was, frankly, an administrative mistake. Silas was a very old man. Caleb, wiping sweat from his brow, felt a prickle of alarm beneath his exhaustion. Thorn made the offer, a cash sum 5 times the motel's low assessed value, to sign the deed over. Right now. No questions asked. Thorn explained it as a courtesy, a simple clearing of an error from the books, allowing Caleb and Elara to walk away with a windfall that would instantly wipe out their crushing debt. The temptation was enormous, a siren call promising immediate, comfortable redemption. Elara gripped Caleb's arm, her eyes pleading with him to take the money, to escape the ruin. But Thorn's demeanor betrayed his casual facade. He was too insistent, too dismissive of the motel's actual worth. He never once looked at the 20 units, the crumbling office, or the breathtaking empty view of the mountain range. His entire focus was fixed on the deed to the land. When Caleb hesitated, trying to explain his family connection and the strange instructions in the will, Thorn cut him off, his eyes turning cold. Sentimentality is expensive, Caleb. This is a business matter. The land is worthless. Take the money. The pressure was the proof. If the land was worthless, why the immediate large cash offer? Why the rushed, suspicious urgency? Caleb, the man who had always sought structure and truth in his failed blueprints, finally found his moral footing. He refused. He told Thorn the property was his legacy, and he intended to keep it. Thorn's expression did not change, but a subtle hardening came into his eyes, a glint of institutional power thwarted by an underdog. He left a business card, a heavy, matte black square, and gave Caleb a final, cold warning. This error will be corrected, Mr. Thorn, one way or another. The black sedan spun in the gravel, disappearing back down the long, empty highway. That night, the silence of the desert was broken by a sound that made the hair stand up on Caleb's neck. It was a high, grinding squeal of metal on metal, a violent noise of force and effort. The clock read 3:13 in the morning. The main power had suddenly, inexplicably flickered and died, plunging the motel into a darkness that only existed far from city lights. Caleb grabbed a heavy wrench and sprinted out of Unit 1, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound was coming from the middle of the motel row, near room 12. As he rounded the corner, his eyes, adjusted to the deep night, caught the faint, retreating shape of the black sedan. It was already peeling away at high speed, its taillights shrinking to twin red dots. But it had left its mark. Caleb reached the block of units and stopped, his wrench useless in his hand. He saw the damage instantly. Someone had been working furiously to pry open the heavy, rusted lock. But they had made a tactical error. They had targeted the wrong room. The industrial lock on room 12 remained untouched. Instead, the window of the adjacent Unit 11 had been violently pried open, its aluminum frame bent inward, clearly mistaken for the windowless vault. The threat was confirmed. It was immediate, well-resourced, and focused. Mr. Thorn wasn't waiting for a court date or an opportunity to negotiate. He was desperate, and he was targeting the motel, and he was targeting room 12. The fact that he was breaking into the wrong room proved 2 things. First, that he had never seen the property up close, relying only on institutional knowledge, and second, that the contents of room 12 were so vital that he would risk arrest to get inside. The simple warning from Silas's will had materialized into a sleek, silent threat, carrying power tools and vast, unknown resources. The simple inheritance had instantly escalated into a deadly conspiracy. The immediate danger of Mr. Thorn's break-in had evaporated with the screech of his departing tires, but the silence that settled over the Solstice Inn was now charged, heavy with the knowledge of a deliberate, escalating threat. They were no longer simply property owners. They were targets. The only path forward was knowledge, They had to know what was in room 12 and why the impeccably dressed representative of institutional power was so desperate to seize it. Caleb and Elara retreated to the small, dusty office. The only uncompromised clue lay inside the sealed, heavy journal that Silas had left behind. With a burst of desperate energy, Caleb forced the lock on the journal's clasp, splintering the fragile wood. The pages within were a chaotic mess of a tormented mind. There were no coherent entries, no personal notes about the weather or the business of the motel. Instead, the book was filled with seemingly meaningless drawings. There were complex, dense star charts that seemed to track celestial bodies no one had ever charted, and layered architectural blueprints that clearly did not match the simple 1950s construction of the motel above ground. These drawings suggested a massive, elaborate structure, a bunker of concrete and steel, lying hidden beneath the scrub brush and the cracked pavement. Interspersed among the schematics were long, frantic lists of dates, written out in full emphatic text: 1934, 1957, and 1981. Alongside these lists were short, handwritten notes in a substitution cipher, a puzzle that resisted Caleb's exhausted mind. Elara, the artist, approached the problem differently. She was not looking for logic, but for pattern, for the intentional stroke of the hand. While Caleb stared in frustration at the cipher, Elara took a piece of charcoal from her sketch bag and carefully shaded the title page of the journal. She rubbed the charcoal across the heavy paper, and the faint indentations of Silas's final heavy pencil strokes appeared, illuminated by the black dust. Silas hadn't written a note on the title page. He had pressed a sequence of numbers into the sheet below it. A simple 3-digit combination was revealed: 373. It was the key to the second puzzle. Caleb scrambled to the bolted-down safe behind the desk, his hands shaking with anticipation. He dialed the combination, 373, and the heavy metal lock of the fire-rated safe clicked open, releasing another breath of that strange, metallic ozone smell. Inside the safe contained only 2 items, preserved perfectly against the desert heat and time. The first was a brittle, yellowed photograph, dating back at least to the 1940s. It showed a young Silas, barely a boy, standing next to a severe-looking older man with an intense, unblinking gaze. The man was dressed in the crisply pressed uniform of a United States Navy Commodore from World War II. The second item was a single, heavy iron key. It was clearly ancient, stained dark with age, and felt unnaturally heavy. Its head was not the brass ornamentation of the other key, but a single, thick rectangle of non-standard, custom-cut iron. It was immediately, explicitly clear that this key was meant for the formidable industrial lock on the door of room 12. The puzzle was complete. They now held the means to enter the vault, but the most vital information came not from the key, but from the land itself, from the secret Silas had been guarding. While trying to place the context of the Commodore's uniform, Caleb used the limited internet signal from his phone to research the historical records of this isolated patch of the Mojave. He began to cross-reference Silas's strange blueprints with local government land records. The truth that emerged was one of historical revisionism, the kind of secret history only the desert could successfully hide. The Solstice Inn had not simply been built on empty land. It was constructed deliberately upon the covered-over ruins of a classified pre-World War II research facility, known only in the deepest archives as the Siderian Project. This was not a military base, but a highly funded shadowy endeavor established by the United States government in the 1930s, ostensibly to harness unconventional atmospheric energy sources. The facility was suddenly and catastrophically abandoned after a mysterious incident in 1946, and the site was officially declared toxic and sealed off. The motel, Silas's home, was nothing more than a thinly veiled cover, a cheap 20-unit, Distraction built to ensure that no one ever thought to dig too deeply into the scorched earth beneath it. The Solstice Inn was not an inheritance. It was a decades-old deception. The true history of the land was sinister, and the contents of Room 12, now accessible by a heavy iron key, were undoubtedly connected to the secrets of the Siderian project. The brass key and the iron key lay heavy on the worn wooden desk, twin tools of destiny. They represented the conflicting forces tearing at Caleb and Elara, the moral warning of a dead relative against the immediate, tangible threat of the living. Silas's final instruction echoed in the silence. Do not enter. Do not open it. A command that had been easy to heed when they lacked the means, but now felt like a taunt. Mr. Thorn had offered them a clean slate, financial redemption, and peace. All they had to do was surrender the deed and walk away. But the violence of his break-in, the cold professionalism of his threat, had irrevocably shifted the moral calculus. To walk away now would not be surrender. It would be complicity in whatever dark, hidden history Silas had spent his life guarding. Under the pressure of debt and danger, they realized their only option was to know what they were protecting. The fear of the unknown was being replaced by the greater fear of the known conspiracy. They moved toward Room 12 under the pale, indifferent light of the desert moon. The sight of the heavily secured door, windowless and secretive, no longer inspired curiosity, but a deep, driving dread. This was the threshold. Caleb took a deep breath, the metallic smell of the desert air sharp in his lungs. He inserted the tarnished brass key into the top deadbolt and the heavy iron key, the one with the bizarre rectangular head, into the industrial lock below. He gripped the keys and twisted. The sound was immense. It was not the gentle click of a normal lock, but a resounding, echoing metallic clang that reverberated through the empty row of motel units. The industrial bolt shrieked as it turned, sounding like a tortured banshee, a noise designed to announce its function. The two mechanisms released simultaneously. Caleb pulled the door toward him, and it swung open with a slow, grinding resistance, the hinges protesting decades of immobility. The camera lingered on the slow, creaking arc of the door, revealing not a motel room, but an entrance. Room 12 was a deception. It was not a guest unit at all, but a small, narrow antechamber, approximately 8 feet deep and constructed entirely of seamless, rough-hewn concrete. The air that rushed out was cold, shockingly cold, and carried that strange, sharp smell of ozone, like the air after a high-voltage lightning strike. There was no furniture, no window, no sign that a living soul had ever resided here. The entire space was dedicated to two objects. The first object dominated the far wall. It was a single, massive steel door, set deep into the concrete foundation. It was sealed with a formidable, ship-wheel-like locking mechanism, its metal polished and smooth, indicating it was the true vault. The door was a monument to the secret that lay beyond it. This was the real barrier, the defense Silas had alluded to. The second object was small, unassuming, and placed on a simple, square concrete pedestal in the center of the antechamber. It was an antique, leather-bound book, its pages protected by age and dry heat. Caleb approached it slowly, feeling the immense, silent weight of the sealed steel vault behind it. This book was the explanation. It was not a diary, but a precise technical ledger, detailing the daily operations, expenditures, and results of the Siderian project, from 1932 through the date of the incident in 1946. The ledger confirmed the official history was a lie. The scientists were not, as the archived records claimed, attempting to harness unconventional atmospheric energy. Their true purpose was far stranger and more institutional. The text, written in the precise, formal hand of a field officer, confirmed that the project was a clandestine endeavor to develop a means of mapping and influencing global communication lines across vast distances, a deep, complex form of historical eavesdropping. They were listening to the world as it had been, attempting to capture the very ghost of past transmissions. Caleb turned the brittle pages, the coldness of the room seeming to sharpen the terror of the words. The project had clearly gone wrong, the experiments becoming increasingly risky and strange. The final chronological entry in the ledger, written on the day of the catastrophic incident in 1946, sealed the chilling secret of the Solstice Inn and confirmed the immense danger they were now in. The script was formal, but the ink was heavy, pressed hard into the paper, conveying a final, desperate urgency. It read, "Project integrity compromised. Atmospheric reception inverted. Containment mandatory. All records destroyed. The door is the defense. The signal is the prize. The key is the bloodline." The ledger dropped from Caleb's numb fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. The mystery of the motel was over. They were no longer guarding a dilapidated business. They were guarding a vault, a concrete defense concealing a signal, a device for historical eavesdropping that the Thorn family, the bloodline, had been trying to retrieve for generations. The fear of the unknown was gone, replaced by the terrifying, chilling reality of a deep, decades-old conspiracy that had just escalated into a physical confrontation. They were holding the key to a true piece of historical revisionism, and the men who wanted it were coming back. The discovery of the Siderian ledger had turned their fragile hope into a clear, terrifying mission. They drove the old sedan down the highway, the brittle ledger secured beneath the passenger seat, heading for the nearest town with a reliable cell signal. They drove with the frantic, tense rhythm of people trying to outrun a coming storm. The storm was waiting for them. 10 miles out, the sleek black sedan was parked discreetly behind a rise of scrub brush, its dark form melting into the heat haze. The vehicle was silent, waiting, a predator in ambush. As their car rounded the final curve, the black sedan pulled out instantly, blocking the highway. There was no hesitation, no negotiation this time, only a cold, institutional certainty. Caleb slammed on the brakes, the tires shrieking a momentary protest that was quickly swallowed by the silence. Retreat was their only option. They executed a desperate, dust-kicking turn and sped back toward the dilapidated shelter of the Solstice Inn. Inside the fortified office, with the door bolted and their blood pounding, they knew the final confrontation was imminent. They had to understand the man pursuing them. Elara, calmer under pressure than Caleb, pulled out the yellowed photograph from the safe. She stared at the severe older man in the World War II uniform standing beside the young Silas. His face was intense, unblinking, the face of a man obsessed with a singular, scientific purpose. The uniform was the key. She looked again at Mr. Thorn's matte black business card, pulling up his biography on her phone's last remaining bar of service. The discovery hit her with the force of a revelation. The man in the photograph was Commodore Arthur Thorn, the lead scientist of the Siderian project. He was the father of Mr. Thorn, their antagonist. The key was the bloodline. The historical truth of the conspiracy clicked into place, sharp and chilling. The Thorn family didn't want the land for its financial worth. They wanted the signal mentioned in the ledger. The original Siderian project, buried and recorded as a catastrophic failure in 1946, had in reality been a success. The device, capable of receiving and mapping historical communications across vast distances, lay dormant behind the steel door. The Commodore had initiated the cover-up, using his institutional power to bury the existence of the device. His son, Mr. Thorn, had inherited the secret and the obsession. The Thorn family had spent decades manipulating the land deed, using their deep pockets to control the official narrative, and ensure the site remained sealed. Silas, the orphan helper at the facility, the man whose job had been to assist the Commodore, was the one who betrayed the conspiracy, using his strange inheritance to create a final defense. The motel, the entire 20-unit structure, was merely a legal defense layer. The deed Caleb now held granted him ownership of the structure on the land, and that structure included room 12 and the massive steel door built into its foundation. As the legal owner of the structure, Caleb was the last infuriating obstacle between Mr. Thorn and the device, the signal, he believed was his birthright. The high offer was not for the land. It was to gain control of the legal means to dismantle the door. A shadow fell over the office door. The muffled sound of an engine dying outside was followed by the loud, authoritative crunch of boots on gravel. The antagonist had returned, and this time, he was not alone. "Caleb," Thorn's voice called out, smooth and amplified, a terrifying sound of control in the vast emptiness. "The time for games is over. We both know what you have. Hand over the deed and the book. This is the only way this ends without further difficulty." The sound of a heavy industrial tool, the same grinding squeal from the night before, began to chew through the lock on the office door. Thorn and his two large, silent associates were applying their institutional power directly to the physical structure. The metal groaned, protesting the violence. Caleb grabbed Elara's hand. They were trapped, boxed in by the man who represented decades of buried wealth and power. The men outside were not driven by petty greed. They were driven by a legacy of absolute scientific control. They didn't want to harm Caleb and Elara. They wanted the documents, the keys, and the clear, legal path to the steel door. The final moment of decision had arrived, signaled by the splintering sound of the office lock giving way under the relentless force. The institutional threat had fully materialized into a physical invasion. The heavy metallic shriek of the grinding tool was a sound of absolute finality. The office door was groaning under the pressure, the ancient wood already splintered near the lock. Thorn's voice, now hard and devoid of its earlier polite menace, barked orders to his silent men. Caleb, Elara, and Jesse were pressed into the corner, trapped in a small, dusty box of an office. The deed and the ledger, the two prizes of the Siderian conspiracy, were still clutched in Caleb's hand. There was nowhere left to run. The institutional power of the Thorn bloodline had finally arrived to claim its history. Cornered, the human mind often defaults to the most basic survival instinct. But Caleb, the failed architect, the man who had lost his identity because his designs had never materialized, defaulted instead to his core, latent skill, the language of structure. His eyes darted around the confined space, searching not for a weapon, but for a hidden solution. His gaze fell upon the journal, its pages now scattered, revealing the confusing, meticulous schematics. The blueprints. They were drawings of a colossal underground structure, a complex of reinforced concrete and steel that existed entirely beneath the motel. It was separate, as Silas had warned, from the flimsy wooden structure above. This was the original Siderian bunker, the true location of the signal. And within those precise, unforgiving lines, Caleb saw the solution. The blueprints included a secondary, emergency shaft, maintenance access tunnel marked by a small, hand-drawn circle near the perimeter of the buried complex. Caleb's architectural training took over, silencing the panic. He didn't need to interpret the symbols. He needed to understand the spatial relationship. The blueprints showed the shaft's access point was located not in the main office or in the motel units, but in the adjacent, small maintenance shed. It was an obscure, secondary entrance, a lifeline placed outside the high-security areas of the vault itself. It wasn't on the motel's property map because it was a function of the bunker. not the business. "The shed," Caleb gasped, grabbing Elara's arm. "The maintenance shed. The access is behind the water heater." Jesse, recognizing the structure of the building from his years in the area, nodded instantly, understanding the logic of a forgotten escape route. Thorn's men were putting their weight into a final, catastrophic breach of the office door. The wood gave way with a sickening, ripping sound. They were seconds from being overrun. Moving with the coordinated desperation of survivors, the three of them burst out of the office's back door, sprinting across the short, gravel path toward the small, standalone shed where Silas had once delivered his paranoid warnings. The air was thick with tension and the expectation of violence. They flung open the shed door. Inside, it was cramped, dusty, and filled with old tools, cans of paint, and a precarious stack of worn tires. In the far corner, a rusting, ancient water heater sat against the back wall. Caleb, driven by the blueprint now imprinted on his mind, shoved the tires aside with a frantic crash. Behind the heater, just as the blueprint had indicated, was a thin panel of rotting plywood, completely unsealed and obscured by shadows and dust. Using the heavy iron key from room 12 as an improvised lever, Caleb pried the panel free. It came away with a weak pop of broken nails, revealing a black, square opening, a maintenance tunnel, that disappeared into the cool, damp earth below. It was just large enough for a person to squeeze through. It was the escape route, the fail-safe Silas had built into his own prison. "Go!" Caleb yelled, shoving Elara toward the opening. She scrambled into the darkness, followed quickly by Jesse. Caleb turned back for a final, frantic second. The sound of shouting came from the office. Thorn and his men had breached the final barrier and were now inside, realizing their quarry was gone. Caleb slipped feet first into the tunnel opening, pulling the plywood panel back into place, sealing himself in total, concrete-smelling darkness. He landed with a soft thud on the damp floor beside Elara and Jesse, the sounds of the men's frustrated shouts filtering down the shaft, muffled and distant. In that moment, breathing the cold air of the underground, Caleb felt a surge of pure, powerful vindication. His debt-ridden past, his failed career, his years of self-doubt, all of it was temporarily erased. He hadn't fought with fists or fire, he had fought with architecture. The discarded knowledge of structural design, the very skill that had failed him in the city, had saved their lives in the desert. They were now safe, if only momentarily, inside the very bunker Thorn sought to control, the lost blueprints their only map through the darkness. The escape had been executed just in time. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, and they were now descending into the heart of the conspiracy. The maintenance tunnel spat them out onto the cold, damp floor of a cavernous space. The air here was heavy with the smell of wet cement and a charged, static electricity, utterly removed from the dry heat above. This was the true core of the conspiracy, the heart of the structure from Silas's dark schematics. They were inside the Siderian Project's bunker. It was immense, a cylindrical concrete chamber of colossal size, perfectly preserved as if the catastrophic incident in 1946 had only just concluded. At the exact center of the chamber, illuminated by a faint, sickly green emergency light, was the reverse side of the vault door they had seen in room 12. The massive steel door was flawless, sealed by the elaborate ship wheel mechanism, and set into its surface was a rectangular, black panel housing a complex, illuminated numerical keypad. This was the access point to the signal, the historical eavesdropping device. They were suddenly no longer alone. A flashlight beam cut through the gloom, followed by the crisp sound of shoes on the concrete floor. Mr. Thorn and his two large associates had followed them down the main stairwell, a functional high-security route only the inner circle would know. Thorn's tailored suit was dusted with grime, his polished demeanor now cracked by a cold, furious desperation. He had them cornered, the end of the line. "You have made a series of reckless decisions, Caleb," Thorn said, his voice echoing in the vast concrete volume. "But they end here. The deed. The book. Now." Caleb and Elara backed toward the steel door, placing the ledger on the small, raised platform of the keypad unit. Thorn advanced slowly, his eyes fixed on the ledger, the historical record of his family's deception. He paused, looking at the immense door. "Do you know what that thing is, Mr. Thorn? You think it's a weapon. You're wrong." Thorn leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, revealing the final piece of the terrifying truth. "My father, Commodore Arthur Thorn, didn't build a weapon of war. He built a receiver. It is a temporal device that only listeners. It cannot change a single thing. It harvests the communications of the past, the ghost transmissions of history itself." His eyes were manic, filled with the inherited obsession of his father. "I do not want to change the past. I want to hear the moments around the incident in 1946. I want to know what my father truly found, what he covered up. That signal is my legacy." Thorn demanded the keypad code, the final key. Elara, staring at the dimly lit keypad, suddenly understood Silas's coded language. She looked back at the journal entry in her memory, the long, written-out dates: 1934, 1957, 1981. These weren't random numbers. They were the precise dates of the 3 major documented land acquisition attempts the Thorn family had used to try and buy back the property over the years, the key moments in their historical cover-up. Silas had recorded the moments of their failure, not the device's success. The dates were not the door's entry code. They were the override sequence. "He didn't leave a key to open it, Mr. Thorn," Elara declared, her voice firm. "He left a key to stop you." Thorn lunged forward, moving with surprising speed toward the platform, his hand outstretched to seize the ledger and the deed. "The game is finished," he yelled. In that heart-stopping second, Caleb executed the plan. He had already established a connection, a final, desperate lifeline. While Thorn was talking, Elara had used the last shred of cell service in the bunker to send a burst message. The image of the Siderian ledger's most damning final entry, the 1946 closure statement, to a trusted, anonymous journalist contact they had identified before driving out. The truth was now free. Caleb spun, his fingers moving rapidly across the illuminated keypad. He entered the sequence of the years, transcribed into numerical format. 1934, 1957, 1981. The steel door did not unlock. Instead, the entire bunker chamber shuddered with a sudden, deep, guttural sound. A high-pitched alarm began to shriek, and the emergency lights flashed red. Above the steel door, a heavy ventilation grill opened, and a violent, hissing sound erupted. It was a centuries-old security measure, a devastating, automated retort to anyone attempting to override the system. A torrent of high-pressure, opaque chemical coolant erupted from the vents, instantly flooding the vast concrete chamber. It was non-lethal, but dense and blindingly thick, filling the space with a choking white fog. Thorn and his men were instantly enveloped, sputtering and stumbling, rendered useless by the sudden sensory deprivation. Caleb grabbed Elara and Jesse, shouting above the alarm, "The schematics! The final shaft!" Guided by the architect's map in his mind, Caleb led them running, blindly, through the dense, burning fog toward a final access point, a simple, high-up maintenance shaft tucked into the far corner of the bunker. They scrambled up the rusted ladder rungs, reaching the single final trapdoor leading to the outside world. Caleb, Elara, and Jesse pulled themselves through the final exit and onto the cool, silent surface of the Mojave Desert, just as the high-pressure spray began to recede, leaving Thorn and his conspiracy trapped, blinded, and defeated in the flooded concrete tomb below. The moral victory was theirs, achieved not through force, but through the ingenious final design of Silas's failsafe. They had exposed the signal by entering the final key. The rising sun found Caleb, Elara, and Jesse standing on the rim of the desert, their faces streaked with grime, but washed clean by the morning light. The high, desperate pitch of the bunker's security alarm still echoed faintly from the sealed maintenance shaft, a final, frustrated cry of the conspiracy. Within minutes, the first police cruisers arrived, followed swiftly by unmarked government vehicles. The message Elara had sent, the terrifying excerpt from the Siderian ledger, had broken through to the anonymous journalist just as the chemical coolant fogged the bunker. The journalist had acted immediately, the truth too compelling and too dangerous to ignore. Mr. Thorn and his associates were detained inside the bunker, blinking and sputtering in the chemical residue, found exactly as the failsafe had left them, trapped beside the vast, illuminated keypad. The evidence was irrefutable. The discovery of the ledger, the highly secured vault of room 12, and the confirmation of the hidden, high-security bunker beneath the motel was enough to launch an immediate, full-scale federal investigation. The story of the Solstice Inn, the historical eavesdropping device, and the decades-long cover-up by the Thorn family and their institutional power instantly became national news. The resolution was not the windfall they had once desperately craved, but something far more meaningful. Caleb and Elara were not just witnesses, they were declared heroes for exposing a systemic, historical wrong. The government, in exchange for their cooperation and the integrity of the evidence, granted them a substantial reward. The overwhelming weight of their crushing debt was instantly, finally, lifted. They were free. The greatest change, however, was not financial, but spiritual. Caleb, the man who had abandoned his blueprints and his skill for the grinding repetition of manual labor, finally returned to his true purpose. He began designing community shelters for displaced families, creating structures of permanence and hope, finally understanding the true function of a strong foundation. Elara, inspired by the vast, quiet solitude of the Mojave and vindicated by the moral fight, returned to her art, finding a depth and fulfillment in her work that had been choked by the smog and debt of the city. They officially sold the Solstice Inn to the government, which immediately designated the entire area as a high-security historical preservation site. The motel was sealed off, the secrets of the bunker secured beneath a heavy concrete cap. Room 12 would never be opened again, its mysteries remaining part of the land's silent history. The long, hard-fought journey proved a simple, profound truth. Silas's final legacy was not the ramshackle motel, but the moral test of the key. He had not left them a treasure to exploit, but a dark truth to protect. Caleb, the underdog, the everyman, found his redemption not in greed, but in the moral conviction to safeguard the historical record and expose the conspiracy. The man who had been defined by what he lacked, money, success, peace, finally found everything he needed in the courage to do the right thing. The greatest treasures in life are rarely found behind a locked steel door. They are found when you choose integrity over temptation, and second chances often arrive disguised as impossible hardship. The sun now beat down on the open desert, a vast, empty canvas symbolizing a new, limitless future, stretching out before Caleb and Elara. The silence no longer threatening, but promising peace.